So, today is the 10th anniversary of Metroid Other M, one of the most diversive and controversial Nintendo games arguably ever made. And that's why I want to bring it up in this video. This is a 10th anniversary special video. I decided I wanted to take a look back with this video and give you guys some background on the history of the game, what Nintendo's approach to Metroid was at the time, and sort of an overview of what went on with the game, what people liked, didn't like, all that kind of stuff. Many of you who are Metroid fans will probably already know all this information, but this is just kind of be an overview looking back at the game, and toward the end I'll give my thoughts on it. Before I want to jump into it though, I just want to say this was the first Metroid game I ever played. I was 13, I believe. I'd heard of Metroid through Super Smash Bros. Brawl. I was playing it with a few friends at the time, and Samus was a character that stood out to me among all the others, and because of her sci-fi kind of look. And I remember looking up Metroid and seeing videos of Metroid Prime and Metroid Prime 3 and just being completely blown away by this first-person perspective. And then I saw Other M and I was mind-blown by the cinematics and the story to it. I wanted to play the game. I wanted all those games, but specifically I wanted to take a look at Other M, since at the time it was the most recent game. And I thought I'd have a better chance of getting that more than the Prime games. So I did get Metroid Other M. I played it, and I love the story. The story is really good, but the bulk of the problem with the game is the gameplay itself, which I will touch on very soon. I had problems with that, with the controls, the awkwardness of trying to be precise. It didn't feel right because we went from... And then when I played Metroid Prime 3 immediately afterwards, playing with a nunchuck felt right. I was surprised that Other M hadn't done that, because playing Prime 3 it felt like it gave you so many more options and combinations and stuff. So I was surprised Other M didn't do any of that. But anyways, I'm going to get right into the bulk of this anyway. So to give you guys background on Nintendo's thinking at the time, Metroid Other M obviously came out in 2010. This was 1 year after they made the Metroid Prime Trilogy Collection for the Wii, 2 years after Metroid Prime 3 Corruption came out. So the last Metroid game was a Prime game, and people had so many expectations around Metroid at that time. Nintendo had been making 2D games, but once they handed Metroid over to Retro Studios, things began to change really quickly. Fans acted negatively at first, obviously, but then Metroid Prime became an absolute masterpiece and it became iconic in gaming culture. And so Retro made a second and a third game, but obviously they couldn't make them forever, and so they decided to put an end while they were ahead of themselves. So they decided they'd make Metroid Prime 3 the final game. Since it was going to be a launch title for the Wii, it seemed fitting. A fitting way to end the series. Even though they wanted to make a fourth game, but that's something for another video. So after Metroid Prime 3 came out, it's safe to assume Nintendo were at an odds with what to do with the franchise. Just coming off the success of Prime, Metroid had resurfaced and been reborn unlike anything it had ever been like before. It was popular for the first time. And so Nintendo knew that they could go back and do a 2D game, but they needed to do something else to keep the franchise alive, to reinvent the gameplay formula on console, basically. And since first person became standard with Prime, they needed to take another approach. So that's when they hired in Team Ninja, and they discussed ways they could change the gameplay, be different from first person, and obviously what came out of that was the idea to make a third person game. Because the idea for a third person Metroid was something that was discussed after Super Metroid came out. The Nintendo 64 was supposed to get a third person Metroid game, but it never happened because Miyamoto didn't feel like Metroid would control very well on that kind of controller. So that never happened. So the idea was still there at Nintendo to make a third-person Metroid game. And so that's ultimately what they decided on. And they incorporated elements of first-person shooting into it. There's scenes in the game where you have to point your Wii remote to look for things and lock on and use missiles. You can't move while in this stance, but you do get this look through Samus's visor. And I feel like that was more a nod to Metroid Prime more than anything else. So on top of that, story is the next thing that comes into play here. Up to this point, Metroid games, there is a story, but it's not abundant, really. The Metroid Prime games had a story, but it was told mainly through the environment and through scanning things in the environment. So it wasn't necessarily story and plot as much as just backstory, stuff that's happened before the events of the game. And the last time they'd done a story-focused Metroid game, other than the Prime games, was Metroid Fusion in 2002. That got mixed reaction based on its story, obviously, and its heavy reliance on narrative over gameplay, but for the most part that game was liked. And they'd hinted of a backstory between Samus and Adam in that game, and since that game was set after Super Metroid, I guess Nintendo decided it would be fitting to set a game between Super Metroid and between Fusion so that they could explore more the story side of things, and that's where Adam comes into play, and I presume the story developed from there. It also comes down as well to, I think Sakamoto wanted to expand the backstory of Samus. Because they had this gap at the start of Metroid Fusion, there was room to fill in a story between Super and Fusion, because you could deal with Samus's reaction and emotions after everything that happened in Super Metroid. And so that's what they went ahead and did, and we've seen the result of it. So the game anyway came out on the Wii in 2010, and it was heavily bombarded and disliked. Shockingly, because the trailers for the game were unanimously loved. The trailers for the game were phenomenal, especially the live action one of Samus looking through her past. You see K2L, you see Ridley killing her parents, all of this. I guess people at the time were thinking that since we were seeing this for the first time, the story was going to really flesh out her early years, and that this could potentially be the best Metroid game yet. So a lot of people had high expectations and were really excited for it. And then when it came out, that's when it got heavily bombarded by fans and critics alike, mostly by fans. So what happened? Well, as I mentioned earlier, the gameplay, the controls specifically of the game, really hindered it. For some reason, Nintendo really wanted to go with a single Wii Remote based control system, which made it very limited because you had so many different options you were trying to do and not enough buttons to do them all. And this led as well to confusion with the first person mode, because it didn't work very well. It felt very limiting and inhibited. That coupled with the level design of the game. Level design in Metroid games is obviously the most iconic aspect of it all. It's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Metroid. You think getting lost in vast areas and finding your way around, getting a new upgrade, backtracking to a previous area because you remembered a room you couldn't get into, and then a sense of progression from that. Metroid Other M didn't have that. The backtracking in this game is often more tedious than enjoyable. In fact, the backtracking in this game will often have you going from one side of the map all the way to the other. And on top of that, you have the story element of Adam giving you orders. This is where people's main issue comes in. I'll touch on this a lot more in a while, but basically with Metroid games, you always have to have your upgrades inhibited in some way. Whether you lose them, you don't have them at all, or in this case you have them and you're not allowed to use them. In theory, I think this is the best way to approach it. The fact that Samus has her weapons and she's not allowed to use them, because it makes much more sense than her just randomly losing them. But it was the execution of the idea that killed it for many people. It was the fact that in obvious situations where you would need to use it, you weren't allowed to use it. Case in point, when you go to, I think it's Sector 2, the fire sector, and for most of that you're kind of burning alive in there before you can use the Varia suit. You don't get to use the Varia suit until you're fighting the boss in there, which is right as you're done and don't need to go back there anymore. So it defeats the purpose in that regard. The fact that Samus as a character is supposed to be defiant. People have certain expectations of her. Her being defiant, being a badass, all this sort of stuff. So the fact of having this iconic female character taking orders from a man didn't really register with a lot of fans. I'm not one of those people that was bothered by it. I liked Adam as a character. I mean, I liked the whole crew, especially Anthony. But I do feel it is a bit odd at certain points. The whole any objections lady thing was peculiar to me a bunch of times, and Samus constantly brings this up at certain points in the game, and it makes you question why. Why is this character who's supposed to be strong, defiant, and confident in herself suddenly very submissive and can't rely on herself anymore? And it's a translation issue, because there are several differences between the Japanese and English versions of this game. Most noticeably for me is, and I talked about this in the last Other M video I did, when Samus fights Ridley, the whole iconic scene where she freaks out when she sees Ridley for the first time, and it has this sort of flashback thing of her as a child or whatever, confused a lot of people as to why this was happening. Why didn't she just kill Ridley the moment she saw him? And people put this down to PTSD, but based on the Japanese version of the game, that wasn't what players were supposed to take away from that. In fact, the idea was supposed to be more that child aspect was symbolic of the powerlessness she felt in that situation. That up to this point in the game, the loss of the baby Metroid, coupled with the destruction of Zebes, which was her homeworld at one point, and suddenly the reappearance of Adam in her life was very confusing and left her very conflicted. And that's essentially what they were going for. That having Adam there was reminding her of this feeling of helplessness in a way, feeling that like she needed to rely on him once again, that she was nothing without him. But that didn't come across in the English version for some reason, and we were left to figure it out for ourselves, basically. As I said, I didn't mind Adam as a character. I didn't find him too irritating, but one thing that strikes me is a lot of people have a huge problem with Samus being involved with the Federation. They claim that this contradicts the manga in some reason. Even though the manga states that Samus, she left Zebes, she joined the Federation army for 2 or 3 years, I think it was, and then she left and became a bounty hunter, which fits right in with the games. But some hardcore fans want to say that this contradicts the games in some ways, even though it doesn't. They didn't like how this was handled in a way. I liked the idea that the death of Ian kind of pushed Samus on her decision, but since we never saw Ian in the game other than that one flashback, and since we didn't know anything about him and had never seen him before, obviously this doesn't impact the players as much as it should, and so it still feels, it doesn't feel as impactful or as rightful as it should in a way. And I guess that's where the main frustration arises from. And then you have the rest of the story dealing with the Federation cloning Metroids and all this, and people have a huge problem with all of this stuff and claiming it contradicts Fusion. I'm not really going to get into the bigger argument with all of that, but realistically, the game doesn't contradict anything. It has problems, but continuity errors are not really one of them, I'd say. For the most part, anyway. The reason I defend the story so much, though, you might be really wondering about this, it's because when you play the game and you start off, you start off in the bottle ship, really desolate and empty. And That's what Metroid games are supposed to feel like. That's the emotion they're supposed to evoke. And since that was my first Metroid game, I guess that's the first time I experienced that with this franchise. The other Metroid games, they have it, but I guess I don't feel it as much as I do when I play Other M, because the story gradually builds up to this. You start off not knowing anything, and then suddenly the plot gets more sinister, worse and worse things happening, and it's this gradual build-up to the climax. And that's what I like about it, that things gradually get worse or dramatic, and that Samus is forced to act on her own. Which, as well, I wanted to bring up Adam's death. Another hot topic for debate that people had with this game. People didn't like that he basically robbed her of the chance of being heroic, and that he died just like his brother did or whatever. Or that it was stupid that he shot her in the back. And while I can admire the fact that he wanted to let her live because she would have died if she'd gone into the sector, what I don't understand about this is that he shoots her in the back before she can shoot that Metroid, when he could have easily talked to her right after she killed the Metroid. So him shooting her didn't need to happen. I get that he did it so that she wouldn't run into Sector Zero immediately afterwards, after he stated his plan, but still it's a bit of a cop-out. So I can give the issues with that a pass on that one. Other than that, the villain of the game, MB, I think, unpopular opinion here, but I think she's one of the strongest villains in terms of being a character that this franchise has had yet, because Ridley is not a fucking villain. Let's be realistic here. He's a reoccurring boss at most. Except Other M, ironically, is the only game that he has any real significance in. But he's not really a real villain. Let's be honest with ourselves here. Dark Samus, her whole thing was just about survival. The SAX was a mindless killing monster. And Mother Brain was just an AI. And with MB, you have that AI being reincarnated, but you have this human emotion flowing into it as well, and the whole connection that she has with Madeline Bergman. And I really liked that. I felt that would have, it was a really cool concept that they had going for her. But man, the way she gets killed off, honestly, is pathetic. I mean, you would have loved to see an actual boss fight where maybe she evolves into Mother Brain or something, but no, you point your cannon at her and that's it. You don't even shoot her or anything, and it's baffling. Like, I can't understand like where that decision comes from, why that was a thing, but it's a thing anyway. But other than that, I think MB was a strong villain, simply because we get to see her manipulating the Federation throughout. The game builds up to that reveal of her being the one that caused everything. I want to talk about the boss fights really quickly. I know this video is all over the place. I'm not really talking about anything in any particular order. I'm just jumping around, but I just wanted to make sure I get everything out that I want to say about this game. The boss fights of this game, most people would say, are weak. And to be honest, the bosses themselves, I think, are pretty solid. It's just the control system that's the problem. The bosses themselves are really fine, especially Ridley, and especially Phantoon. Hell, Phantoon as the final boss is still the most jaw-dropping boss fight I have ever seen in a game yet. And yet, it's still pretty easy because you can dodge every attack so easily, and you just wail on him without much resistance because it's very easy to dodge attacks, because the control system doesn't give you a challenge when enemies are attacking you. And that goes for like the general enemies you see around as well. Most of them are a nuisance, but like, they can't really harm you that much, so there's no real challenge coming from the environment. The challenge really comes from you can't get into a certain area because you're not authorized to. And that's the issue. There's no sense of progression that comes. You're not acquiring upgrades, really. With the exception of the diffusion beam at the beginning, but other than that, you don't acquire anything, and it does take away from what people expect from a Metroid game in that sense. If they had tweaked that, the game would have already been a lot better. Not great, but still would have been a lot better. Going back to the plot again, the deleter is a thing that's in this game. What can we say about this? Part of the whole conspiracy theory that this game weaves in about the Federation trying to create biological weaponry. And that a member of Adam's team is an assassin, and you're introduced to this right after fighting the third boss, but you never see this deleter. The game doesn't really touch on it ever again. You see them killing other members of the team, but you don't really see who they are. You don't get conclusion. And ultimately you have to guess in the end who it is. If I'm correct, I think it was James in the end, because Anthony, after you defeat Ridley, you see Anthony leaving and entering the main sector, and then you see the deleter, who's James, in that other room, control room with Melissa, trying to kill her or whatever. But again, no conclusion, no expansion on that, if you know what I mean. So that was a really weak part of the game. Like, that felt like it was just sort of tacked on onto the end to sort of expand a bit more, or they felt they were expanding a bit more on what was there, but it just served to sort of confuse matters a bit more. On a positive note though, I do want to say the visual look and the soundtrack for this game are incredible. The soundtrack is some of the best Metroid music there is. I'm not afraid to say that. This game does have some really good music. And the visual style, I think the art style of this game is really good and really stand out. It's the gameplay that weakens it all, that brings it crashing down. It's the limited environments. It's no progression that really just makes this slow to get through, because you feel annoyed and bored that you can't really do anything meaningful as you're going through each sector. And I guess the story, the constant cutscenes and stuff were a problem for many people, but I like having extra story in a Metroid game. This and Fusion and soon Prime 4 are the only Metroid games, and I guess Federation Force, where story is a big aspect of it. So I like seeing story and background lore being implemented into it, but it was just the execution and mixing that in with... It's the way they chose to do it, the dialogue as well, the choice of words bothered a lot of people. The constant, iconic use of the word "the baby" every once in a while. It was at the beginning so much, and then there's that cringy intro with Samus saying, "Babies cry." It was, although it was crying specifically for me. That whole thing was horrible. No one liked that, but it did stop getting brought up toward like the middle section of the game, but still it was mentioned here and there, and I was like, we get it, you don't need to mention it so much. But and the voice acting for Samus, no disrespect to Jessica Martin, it's just the direction that she was given. Her voice is fine. In fact, I think the voice suits Samus. It's the tone is the problem. It's the monotone expression. Like, my long-standing nemesis, Ridley, and the baby met its end above my head. There's no emotion, there's no power in her voice that you'd expect. So, I mean, you know, if Samus was ever going to talk in a future Metroid game again, I would have no issue with them bringing back Jessica to voice her, as long as they did more. There was more personality and more actual acting thrown into the voice, because the voice itself is good. It's just the tone and the wording that was made that weak and left a really sour taste in people's minds. What else to say about this game? I could be here forever trying to go through all the different details that people liked and didn't like, but I just wanted to give a brief overview. I didn't want to get too nitty-gritty into it. I just wanted this to be an anniversary video. I'd say a tribute, but if I said that, the Metroid fans among you would probably immediately unsubscribe and dislike the video, so call this what you will, it's an acknowledgement of this game. On a final note though, the drought is, I guess, the biggest problem people have with this game. If we had another Metroid game, another home console Metroid game soon after Other M came out, I think the anger would have subsided a lot sooner and people would have moved on. What happened was Other M was the last Metroid game on the Wii. Because it came out in 2010, the Wii was decommissioned in 2011. So Nintendo came out with the Wii U. We expected another Metroid game on the Wii U. It didn't happen for the main reason being the Wii U didn't sell well and Nintendo didn't want to spend the time developing a game they knew wouldn't sell well, since Metroid games don't have a good track record with sales anyway. But people overlooked this. People saw this as Nintendo abandoning Metroid because one game was heavily criticized. Fans really looked into it, and we had 6 years before we got another game, and that was the time where I was into Metroid. My first ever Metroid videos on YouTube were done during this time, and I remember it very vividly. We were always wondering, like, what new game would Nintendo do next? Every E3 we were expecting another Metroid game. It never happened. Metroid Prime 4 was talked about so many times. People felt that if Nintendo brought out Metroid Prime 4 on the Wii U, it would make up for Other M. We could forgive them and move on, and we would have the game we want. But it didn't happen, and we also didn't get Metroid Dread on the 3DS during that time, so people felt like Nintendo weren't paying them attention, they were forgotten about. Because for the 25th anniversary in 2011, for some reason Nintendo completely blanked Metroid. They didn't mention it for its anniversary like they did with Mario and Zelda, which obviously infuriated so many people, and understandably so. That is one thing I don't really condone on Nintendo's part. That was a dick move, but it was a painful time. 6 years without a new game, and with the last game being one that was highly controversial and mostly disliked. And then 2015 came, we got Metroid Prime Federation Force, and I was the only person on the planet who was really happy when that game was announced. I really liked what I saw, I was super excited, and I was confused when I saw the hate. But the game came out, I like it, I think it's great. It does have its problems, but the vast majority of the Metroid fan base were infuriated even more because we had Other M, and then we had this other game that was, in most people's eyes, just as bad. And so the anger was ever higher now, demanding for a home console Metroid game. Because the Switch was about to come out. The Switch came out, we were expecting a Metroid game. And the rest is history. You know what happened then. Prime 4 was announced 2017. Samus Returns came out in 3DS. And since 2017, we have not had a new Metroid game since. So the last 10 years, we have only had 3 games. And all 3, in their own ways, have been diverse. Other M, for what I've explained. Federation Force, for it being a spin-off that wasn't a main console game, and because it wasn't as serious as Metroid games should be. And Samus Returns, mainly because of it being an actual bad game and for the horrible art style, on top of the fact that AM2R, the fan-made remake, was shut down at the time. There was a whole mess between people being in support of one or the other. I didn't really care about AM2R because it was a fan game, but Samus Returns for me wasn't any good. In fact, I dislike Samus Returns as much as most people dislike Other M. But my point is, we've had 3 games in the past 10 years where each of them have had some level of criticism to them. None of these games have been ones that have had fans really happy. The last time we had a Metroid game where fans were really happy and could agree that it was good was 2007 Metroid Prime 3 Corruption. And that's why we're really happy for that Prime 4 is coming out, because it will be the first Metroid game that we can all come together and unanimously enjoy again. And hopefully it really marks the end of this drought. And I hope it's not another like 6 years before we get another Metroid game. But looking back on it now, it's been a crazy 10 years for Metroid. Because the biggest thing that hurts about it all was that the 2000s were huge for Metroid. We were getting 2 Metroid games a year. In 2002 we had Prime and we had Fusion. In 2004 we had Zero Mission and Prime 2. And then in 2005 we had Pinball and we had Metroid Prime Hunter's First Hunt. In 2006 we had Hunters, and then 7 we had Metroid Prime 3. So we had Metroid games all the time. There was no gap between games. And then suddenly we were at this 6-year gap. So that's where like the main pain came from, and I can understand why people felt Nintendo abandoned the franchise because of Other M. Because it seemed like everything was going so well, and once the criticism of Other M came out, suddenly Metroid was dead. But in actual fact, it was mostly the Wii U. The blame is mostly on the Wii U and its sales. I guarantee you if the Wii U was selling reasonably well, Nintendo would have made a Metroid game for it. I don't know if it would have been Prime 4 or if it would have been something like Other M, but they would have done something for it, and that would have alleviated the pain. Since it's been 10 years, we can hope now that this chapter has been put to rest. And I did a speculation in my last few Metroid videos that Nintendo would announce a remaster or remake of Other M for the Switch on the 10th anniversary of Other M. At the time of this recording, it hasn't happened, but maybe when I upload this it will. I'm not holding my hopes up. I doubt they will, but I was kind of believing they would. But no, I think it's safe to assume now Nintendo are gonna let this game be a thing of the past. Forget it existed, forget the mistakes they made, and move on to better and brighter things. And hopefully we can start to see a resurgence in Metroid and more frequent releases from this point on. And in a way, it's just interesting in a way to me. Like, I know to many people it's just a 10-year anniversary of a really bad game, but the way I'm looking at it as the closing of a chapter. We've hit a decade since this game has come out. We've all said all our things we dislike about the game so many times. We're slowly starting to see a resurgence in Metroid, so hopefully this is the closing of a chapter and this is the end of this long drought, and hopefully this will all just be a bad memory for us. But for the game overall, as I said, it suffered from Nintendo not really understanding what they should have done. That's really it. And being in the shadow of the Metroid Prime trilogy really made this game suffer as well. But as I said, there's a story in this game. It's interesting enough, and the music helps along with it. So it has a few redeeming qualities, but it has a lot of issues with it. But if you haven't played this game yourself, I suggest you do. If you have a Nintendo Wii, pick up this game and try it out. From the gameplay I'm showing on screen here, maybe it piques your interests. And who knows, maybe you'll like it, and probably not. But if you have played it, let me know down in the comment section below. What are your thoughts on Metroid Other M? Everything about it. How do you feel about the whole 6-year drought we had with Metroid games? Has your opinion on Other M changed over the last 10 years? Everything you have to say, I want to hear it down in the comment section below. And yeah, I'm going to leave that here. Thank you all for watching, and please subscribe. Novus Corvus out.